Hello everyone. In this series of videos, what we're going to do is go through your crash course in Illustrator. We're going to start with a brief introduction to the software, what makes Illustrator different from programs like Photoshop or InDesign. We'll start looking at how to create graphics in Illustrator, and then we'll start looking at how you can apply this to your typography project, which involves you vectorizing the letter forms that you photographed over the course of this entire semester. So this first video here, what we're going to do is explain the difference between Illustrator and Photoshop and the kinds of graphics you create in there. So I've got both Illustrator and Photoshop open down the bottom here. And I've got a similar graphic created in each. So in Illustrator here, we have this black dot in the middle of a square document. And we've got the same thing here in Photoshop as well. So you can see we're looking at Photoshop up the top there. So you can see if I switch between these two programs, Illustrator, Photoshop, we have what looks to be pretty much an identical graphic. But crucially, there is a key difference between these two. So in Photoshop, which is something you're possibly more familiar with at the moment, you're dealing with what we call raster graphics. Now, you're probably familiar with the term raster graphics. Basically, when you hear the word raster, it refers to pixels. So anything you do in Photoshop is made up of pixels. In Illustrator, you're dealing with something completely different. Illustrator doesn't work on pixels. Illustrator works with what we call vector graphics. So vector graphics are not based on pixels, but they're rather based on coordinates or points in space, which are joined together with other elements, and you can create shapes and objects in programs like Illustrator, which are then redrawn every time you zoom or resize or something like that. Now, at the moment, given the two documents I have, for all intents and purposes, these two things look pretty much the same. However, there is a crucial difference. So going back into Photoshop with our raster graphic here, I'm going to zoom into this one and keep zooming. You can see as we zoom and get closer and closer and closer, the raster grid becomes more apparent. So the raster grid basically refers to all of the pixels which make up your work. So in a document such as this one, this black dot is basically just a big grid of black, white, and as you can see here, a couple of grey pixels, essentially. So you zoom in quite close, those pixels become very apparent, and you can see pixels that make up that object there. Keep in mind that zooming in is kind of the same thing as making something bigger as well when you're dealing with graphics like this. So you might have experienced this yourself before. When you take a raster graphic in Photoshop, if you blow it up and make it too big, it starts to become pixelated. That's just one of the restrictions of the format. Might be tricky to see in the video, but you might notice that we're zoomed in 3200% here, which is the maximum that Photoshop allows you to zoom, and the pixels are quite apparent. Switching over to Illustrator, we're dealing with a vector graphic, not a raster. So as I zoom in, you'll notice that pixels don't ever actually become apparent. So I'm zooming in, I'm getting closer, and I'm getting closer and closer, and closer still. Now, you probably can't see this, but I'm actually zoomed in 64,000% in this case compared to the 3,200 I was zoomed in Photoshop. And you'll notice that even at this really high magnification, there's no pixelation to be seen. And that's because in Illustrator, this object is not made up of pixels. If I zoom back out again, what this object is actually made up of is, well, let's see. I'll just go to a different mode here so we can see this a certain way. So this is how this dot is defined in Illustrator, and there are a number of key elements which make up this shape. So you can see at the top, bottom, left and right, we have these little dots here. These are called points or nodes. Some people might talk about them as anchors or vertices as well. Joining those points together are what we call paths. And so there's a path between this point and this point here, which goes around like so. And we have a completed shape here, which is also what could be called a closed path. So that means as you follow those paths around, they eventually join up again at a certain point. Each one of these points has these little things attached to them which are called handles. And handles are instructions that tell a path how to behave. So as I manipulate this handle, for example, you can see the curve that the path takes to join those 2 points together changes considerably. It's perfectly possible in Illustrator to have points which do not have handles, and I'll remove all of these handles now. So you can see without any handles on those points, these paths here have no instructions telling them to curve, therefore you get straight lines, which is perfectly fine. It just depends on what you're going for in Illustrator. So those are the three main elements that make up your vector graphics: points, paths, and handles. Completely different to Photoshop because that's a raster graphic. In that case, you're just dealing with pixels. So it's a completely different form of graphics. When you create shapes or closed paths in Illustrator, there'll also be attributes to those shapes or paths as well. And what I mean by that, an attribute is kind of like a color or an appearance. So this dot, for example, its attributes are that it's filled with black and that there is no outline around the object, or what they call a stroke. Now, I mentioned earlier that if you consider that zooming in is the same as kind of like resizing or blowing up an object, you can see that there is an advantage to graphics in Illustrator in that you can enlarge something as much as you'd like and you never experience pixelation in Illustrator. So because you're not dealing with pixels, you have no pixelation. In fact, because you're not dealing with pixels in Illustrator, you don't have a resolution. Vector graphics are what we call resolution independent graphics. So what this means for you is you can resize a graphic in Illustrator as big or as small as you like, and the quality is always perfect. So big advantage there. It does bring up the question, why would you ever use raster graphics if you can work with vector graphics and create something that has no resolution and can be scaled however you want? Why would you ever go and use pixels? And the answer to that question, or sorry, the counter to that, I suppose, is with vector graphics, you can't create the same kinds of effects that you can create with rasters. So for example, if you need something that looks photographic, you need pixels for that. That kind of complex series of colors and that complex amount of detail is only really possible with raster graphics, unless you're prepared to spend many, many hours in a program like Illustrator creating lots and lots of tiny little shapes with different colors. So yeah, high amounts of detail or texture or photographic type quality, that's what you need Photoshop for. Illustrator is better for stylized graphics, or illustrations as the name suggests. So to give you an example, this is a vector graphic here. What you'll often see as a hallmark of vector graphics is you can pick out all of the shapes that the designer has made. So if I just start grabbing some of these shapes here which make up this vector portrait, oops, that was a bit detailed. You can see it's just a bunch of shapes that someone has drawn in and then stacked on top of each other to create this, what we call a vector illustration here. So this is an example of what vector graphics are good at doing. You can see it doesn't look photographic, it's not meant to, it's meant to be an illustration, and this is the kind of thing the program is best at doing here. Unlike Photoshop, where you have tools and filters and things which will create a lot of detail for you, in Illustrator you have to create every single shape yourself. So all of these shapes here for the hair and the detail around the eyes and the beard and everything, all of these were created by the designer by drawing them in manually. So as you can imagine, if you want large amounts of detail, you're going to be there for a very long time creating lots and lots of shapes. Now, because vector graphics are resolution independent, there are certain kinds of things that they're well suited to. So one of the main things that vector graphics are best for is logos or logo types. A logo needs to be scaled up and down very frequently. You need to use it at lots of different sizes, so it's ideal to have a graphic format that can respond well to being resized, i.e. not pixelate at all. So most good logos you see will be vector graphics. Of course, one of the reasons we're doing it in your typography class is also because vector graphics are fantastic for type. So this is an example of a little logo type here. And you can see this is all made up of little points and paths and things as well. In fact, let's just do it here. You deal with vector graphics all the time without knowing it, because most typefaces you use on your computer are actually vectors as well. That's why you can make your text in programs like Word or Photoshop or whatever as large or as small as you like, and you don't experience pixelation. It's because all of those fonts that you're using are actually vector graphics. Let's just can't type very well. And that needs a T. Let me just make some text here and blow it up. So type that you create in Illustrator, like any program actually, is a vector graphic. And one of the great things about Illustrator, and one of the reasons why it is good for typography, is because, you can actually access the vector construction of that type. So with a simple command in Illustrator, I can now gain access to all of the points and paths which make up those letter forms. And for certain graphic applications, that makes it easy for you to actually start modifying the construction of these characters, which leads to unique typographic solutions. What else are we doing? Let's get rid of that counter there. Or, because they are vector elements, I can grab all of those letters and move them separately as well. So yeah, you can see for manipulating type, Illustrator is a great choice. Now what you're going to be doing later is creating your own type. So what we'll start looking at in the next couple of videos is how you can go about creating and manipulating your own vector graphics. So that will begin in the next video.